My name is Daoud Kutab. I'm a journalist and I run a media organization in Amman, Jordan. I also write for Al Monitor and Arab News. And in 1996, I noticed something very strange in the Arab world. If I ever wanted to know anything about Syria, all I had to do was open the Egyptian newspapers. And if I wanted to know about Algeria, all I had to do was go to the Tunisian papers. And if I wanted to know about Morocco, all I had to do was... And so I basically discovered early on that Arab countries' media are really, really free about everything in the Arab world except their own country. So I created something called Amin, the Arab Media Internet Network. Amin, basically we brought all the Arab newspapers into one site, and so you can really find out about your country just by reading other papers. Later on in 2000, I created the Arab world's first internet radio, Amman Net Radio, which was an interesting invention because most people start with FM and then they go to the internet, but in Jordan they didn't have internet, they didn't have FM licenses, so we began with the internet, and then with the help of a Palestinian radio station, we basically bypassed the government monopoly. So we were broadcasting out of Amman, downloaded in Bethlehem, played back into Amman, and so basically we did something totally illegal, but in a legal way. And that began a process of training people into how to use local media, and the internet really was helpful. But at that time, quickly I realized I did a course at Princeton University that governments were really quickly catching up on the problems of the internet, and they were creating their own, the government and the intelligence, their own internet websites. Some of the famous internet sites created early on were done with the government's help because they really wanted to, A, be part of the system, and also they wanted to use that to kind of catch some of the biggest opponents. So this session today is going to be very open. We'll try to address both the problem, the dissent, and trying to find a way to find other narratives. I am very proud and happy to have with us Sarah Lee Whiston from the Human Rights Watch and Courtney Retsch from Committee to Protect Journalists. Thanks for the prize you gave me a while back. Hala Al-Dosari from the MIT Center for International Studies, and Such Jahali from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. So we'll begin with dealing with the problem. I would like to talk about how governments engage their own citizens in the Arab world. We'll begin with Human Rights Watch Middle East Director Sarah Lee Whiston. Can you please tell us about the basic issues of government's efforts to silence attempts by citizens to express themselves? And let's zoom in on what is happening not only in the public at large, but also to the profession of journalists. Sarah.
So basically, I think in a very broad brushstroke, we can say that the governments of the Arab world see their own citizens, their own populations as a threat. They are a threat to their legitimacy. They are a threat to their privilege, they are a threat to their corruption, and in many ways they are enemies or potential enemies. And that was very clearly on display in the 2011 uprisings, where the citizens of much of the Arab world made it clear that they were going to vote with their feet and emerge to protest. And since then, and on the heels, of course, of the expansion of Arab journalism through previously uncontrollable means, such as the satellite, Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, other satellite stations broadcasting from outside the region, whether it's London or Istanbul or other places, as well as the free social media, the Facebook and the Twitter, that suddenly empowered their citizenry with both knowledge, information, and the ability to voice their opinions. Big threats to Arab governments that don't want their publics to be knowledgeable, informed, and able to express their opinions. We basically saw and continue to see a very massive broadening legal and forceful crackdown and control on these means of information and expression. One basic way that governments have now sought to curtail the ability of their citizens to obtain knowledge and information is by blocking internet stations, satellite stations, websites, including Human Rights Watch's in many, many countries, because they don't want their citizens to have this information and knowledge. The other is by a vastly expanded body of laws that at one point were more traditionally defined to curtail speech that disrupted order or threatened values or actually incited violence. And in fact, in Kuwait's law, you will still see that speech that's defined as criminal actually has to be tied to some kind of act of violence. Instead, in many other states, now you have cybercrime laws and other bolstered limits on speech that don't have any criteria for, or let me say, the only criteria for determining what is unlawful speech that can end you up in jail is if it is critical of the government. I mean, you have laws in the region that specifically say if you criticize the state or you criticize the government by insulting them, you will go to jail. And the governments have not been shy about using these laws to jail people. And so now it is actually a crime to criticize governments. They've also, in some countries that may not have these expansive cybercrime laws or as expensive, extensively use criminal defamation laws. So Lebanon, for example, which might otherwise stand out as a place where the press is freer and citizens are freer, in fact has dozens and dozens of people who have been criminally prosecuted for defamation. Basically, if you criticize a government official or a government minister by saying his policies are bad, you have defamed him and he's going to sue you, or some public citizen is going to sue you, and you're going to go to jail. So that's another common tool. It's also used quite a bit in Morocco. Finally, the new expanded tools of repression are surveillance, massive and wide-scale surveillance of citizenry. Obviously, this is not a phenomenon that's limited to the Middle East and North Africa. Indeed, the technologies that the governments are using for this come from Western states, and Israel, in particular, is a big producer of surveillance technology, which of course it uses against its own population and the Palestinian territories. But this is a pretty new phenomenon of limiting, controlling, policing, monitoring the expression of citizens. And then, there's always the old style brute thuggery, where governments use physical violence to beat, arrest, detain, and torture journalists, citizens, writers, without any legal pretext at all. So
thanks, Sarah. Thank you. I remember you talked about the insult law. Our radio station once had a person read from the internet comments to people about the parliament. And somebody wrote the parliament in Jordan is Majlis Dawab, مش Majlis Nawab. Dawab means donkeys. And the parliament was really upset, and they went to court and they fined this 10,000 JDs and so on because somebody on radio said that they are not parliamentarians. So it's a very well used law. But most constitutions, and I'm directing my question now to Courtney, most constitutions in the Arab world clearly say that freedom of expression is guaranteed. Now, usually it follows one line, in accordance to the law. And that in accordance to the law usually is where they really restrict you. So can you tell us more about how governments in the Arab region achieve this repressive outcome that we're seeing, despite the fact that expression is guaranteed and freedom of expression and speech is guaranteed, so-called, in the Constitution?
Sure. So I think it's pretty clear that none of the countries in the Middle East are governed by their constitutions. The idea that you would have a constitution and then have a loophole except as defined by law, and then have criminal defamation, as Sarah said, criminal false news laws, cybercrime laws that criminalize journalism, clearly provide some major loopholes. So what we've seen is a real trend in the criminalization of journalism. and the criminalization of speech online. So, prior to the uprisings, there was a lot more space for free expression, for creativity online, and a lot of the governments didn't quite figure out what was happening online, and they thought, okay, well, that's kind of out there, this virtual world. But they quickly, obviously, learned the lesson during the uprisings, and they learned very quickly and started cooperating and coordinating. And I don't think any of them have given one thought to their constitution. There have been a proliferation of cybercrime laws, of counterterrorism laws, of countering violent extremism laws, and of false news laws. And so Egypt, where I worked and did my doctoral studies, used to be the only country on Freedom House's Freedom of the Press Index that ranked as partly free on that index and not free on the Political and Civil Liberties Index, which was kind of interesting. And, there was a bit of space for critical media. Certainly it was state-dominated media. But what we have seen now is that across the region, the regimes in power are combining traditional censorial tactics, such as imprisoning and harassing journalists, with sophisticated surveillance, computational propaganda, state-sponsored trolling, and other efforts to silence the independent press. So last year, we saw that of the 250 journalists who were imprisoned around the world during our annual census, 61 journalists were imprisoned in the Middle East, with Egypt topping the list every year for the past 3 years running as one of the top 3 jailers of journalists. And we've seen record numbers of journalists jailed around the world. So that's really saying something about the crackdown there. We've also got, severe censorship. So whereas there used to be a bit of more space online or on social media platforms, now we have targeted, systematic censorship online, both with respect to specific websites as well as to entire internet shutdowns during times of protest. I think a lot of people thought that the lesson learned during the shutdown of the Egyptian internet in 2011, which was really the first big news event of that type, was that it would send a signal that you can't do that or you're going to suffer economically. And instead, we've seen the exact opposite signal sent. And that's now a standard tactic used throughout the region, from Iraq to Lebanon to Egypt and elsewhere. And then you couple this with sophisticated PR, public relations, and strategy consulting from both domestic and Western firms to help these countries control their image, to help them adopt, as Sarah mentioned, very sophisticated surveillance technologies. And whereas the most recent, I'm sure many of you saw the most recent revelations about the NSO group hacking WhatsApp, that technology, Pegasus, has been linked to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in terms of being found on his colleague's phone. It has been linked to the murder of it has been linked to journalists who were murdered in Mexico and elsewhere. And of course, the revelations by Facebook, which owns WhatsApp, shows that more than 1,000 people were targeted, including hundreds of journalists. But this is also not new, right? We remember that after the Egyptian uprising, they found Nile fish, very sophisticated surveillance software, which also not only has the ability to hack and target these journalists, but also creates a chilling effect as people assume that they are being watched and are under surveillance. So basically, we see, I think, that a lot of these governments have essentially ignored their constitutional provision. They've adopted laws and practices that completely undermine rhetorical guarantees for press freedom.
Thanks, Courtney. Mentioning cybercrime law, we fought very hard in Jordan to stop detention of journalists. And so we finally changed the law, and now journalists cannot be detained. And then they passed the cybercrime law, in which a journalist can be detained for what they write online. So you can write an article in a print newspaper, nothing happens. You don't go to jail, nothing. You're not even detained. The moment somebody pushes publish online the same article that you were exempt from being detained, you can be detained based on the cybercrime law. So the governments are like always trying to find new ways to restrict. We're going to move now to the Gulf region, and we're very fortunate to have Hala al-Dosari from MIT Center with us. Now, we all heard, amazing and scary, detailed story about what happened to Jamal Khashoggi, but I really am interested in the situation of female journalists, especially in Saudi Arabia. I've known a few of them, and I found them to be the most courageous women of all. The journalists really fight very hard. So, Hala, can you tell us more about writers, researchers who are around, especially those who were rounded up in September 2017, specifically the way the charge sheets against these women activists were used?
Yeah, sure. So we've seen patterns of, unprecedented attack on not only on women activists, but also on thought leaders, on religious reformers, on influential influencers online, on influential business leaders. So it all started soon after the ascent of Mohammed bin Salman, the Prince Mohammed bin Salman, to become a crown prince. Those types of the pattern of arrests were very much unprecedented, as I said, in scope, because it really affected everyone under the pretext of protecting national security. Also fall under the pretense of, violating the cybercrimes law or violating the anti-terror law. We've seen the nature, the escalating, basically, coercion and brutal treatment of those detained to the extent that we've heard of people being disabled, being killed under torture or under interrogations. Unfortunately, because of the media blocking in Saudi Arabia, we couldn't really verify much of those arrests. But with the advent of the leak on the Khashoggi's murder, what happened is many of the families of those detained had to pressure their imprisoned relatives to ask about the remarks. The first time I've heard about those signs, I was very much like, suspicious. They did not really, they're naturally not a result of a confinement, even if it's a solitary confinement, uncontrollable shaking of hands, bruises in certain areas like on the neck. So the families and myself and other activists were very much like worried that they might really assign to similar pattern of torture to those that has been leaked through those who were detained and the families of those detained at the Reds, or similar to what happened to Jamal. So then the families were able to obtain more information, and some of those families were placed under travel bans for leaking those information, and some of them were arrested, the son of one of the prominent women activists. The charges were very much like ambiguous and catch-all charges, and very much like related to their line of work, contacting media journalists, the official foreign media journalists, getting in touch with NGOs, sharing research through WhatsApp, research relevant to their own area of expertise, whether it's like Hassan Farhan al-Maliki, one of the religious reformers, having books that talks about how to reform the Islamic jurisprudence, or the women activists having shared, having evidence that on their phones that they have shared research on reforms of women's rights with other citizens in the Arab Gulf states. So we've learned from those kinds of charges that it is a charge, based on curtailing their transnational networking and association, very much like in line with what my co-panelists have described. It's not directly towards a certain expression, but to having more influence on that.
Thank you so much. Obviously, all these problems we've been hearing about, human rights violations of things like the First Amendment, I'm sure are covered very well in the American press, right? So, we have a situation where, unfortunately, the American media has not been covering such a violation, and I would like Sat to give us a bit more details, especially about the general coverage of these issues, but specifically about Palestine, and how the main themes of Israel's narratives since 67 or 682 has been evolving.
Yeah, I put Palestine to the side for a second because it's a separate case. But in terms of looking at this question and how media, American media, tell these stories, I think there's two levels at which we have to think about. One is the kind of broad cultural level in terms of how the Arab world is understood. And this frame has been around for a long time. Edward Said talked about it in the 1980s. Jack Shaheen talked about it through his book, Real Bad Arabs. And this is, the Arab world is essentially one different globe. And there's very little differentiation within it. And it's really seen through this notion of the clash of civilizations, that this is a very, very different world, that they're not like us at all, that they're alien, that they're given to violence. That's where terrorism flows from. So that's the frame, that's the context within which all other, within which we then talk about specific things. In terms of how these events are covered, again, we can go back. There's an institutional structure then on top of the cultural one. And the institutional structure is the structure of American corporate media and the relationship between American corporate media and the American political elites. And again, Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman gave the best kind of framework for this, which is, if you want to understand how American media are treating events around the world, the most important thing to look at is whether the countries that are being looked at are enemies or whether they're allies. If they're allies, there will be a very different frame given to whatever problem we look at. If they are enemies, there'll be something else. And this is a very, very, Chomsky and Herman did this very scientifically, but you can just think about it. I mean, look at the case of Saddam Hussein. You know, before he invaded Kuwait, he was a friend of American elites and was covered very well. The moment he invaded Kuwait, he became an enemy and went from being not really talked about to being Hitler. Same person doing the same thing, and the only thing that changed was the relationship to the American government. And I think that when you look at someone like the murder of Khashoggi as well, Khashoggi became, I mean, in one sense, he wasn't a Saudi. He became an American because of his work with Washington Post, and was seen as was seen in a very different way, with almost no mention of what else has gone on in Saudi Arabia and of course many of the other the repressive Arab states. We do know a lot about the enemies. We know a lot about Assad and about his brutality. And so I think those are the two things. If you have the cultural thing, then on top of that, this institutional frame that can be made sense of in looking at the relationship between corporate media and American elites.
Thank you. Sarah, and let's go into the silencing of the dissent and what does it mean? With Human Rights Watch, this jailing of journalists, silencing of them, how does it affect the kind of ecosystem of human rights? How does it affect the future? I mean, what does it do to human rights activists? Does it do to journalists, academic freedoms in the region? I mean, human rights goes much farther than just journalists. You were talking about freedom of expression in general. How does all this chilling effect, if I can use the word, affect all these other areas that are important for human rights activism?
Well, I mean, as I think would be entirely predictable, leads and has led to a dramatic closure of freedom in its many expressions, not just political freedom, but artistic freedom, cultural freedom, the freedom to expand new forms of thought, new thinking about women, new thinking about relationships, the nature of relationships, LGBT relationships, space that is necessary for any society to grow and evolve and develop and change, which, you know, like any living thing must do, is stifled, repressed, and clamped down. And obviously, from studies that I've seen, it's also led to massive increases in depression, anxiety, suicide rates. I mean, the numbers for Gaza in particular are off the charts, in part because of the very broad military and political repression there. There's also obviously the creation of a vast exodus, a vast brain drain from the Middle East. Those who are lucky enough not to be killed or not to be jailed, languishing in solitary confinement on bare concrete floors, like many of the former government of Egypt under President Morsi, including President Morsi himself, and have managed to get out. Are now living in exile, which is a tremendous loss, of course, for their countries, for their peoples, but also a tremendous loss for them. So it's I think, a key factor in continuing to hold back the natural, and what should be the natural evolution and development of these societies, and almost leads them to be stuck in time. And one of the biggest problems, of course, is also the education component, which is the level of censorship and control of academic freedom, not just at the university level, but even at the elementary school level, where, for example, we know that students are not even learning that there was a revolution in 2011, that there was a democratic election in 2011. An entire generation of Egyptian children are not learning about this.
Thanks. Courtney, in our business as journalists, we talk a lot about the word self-censorship. And most people think of self-censorship as coming always from the negative side, that people are being pressured and therefore they are careful what they write. But there's also what we call ihtiwa al-na'im, the soft kind of sponsorship where things are offered to you so that you don't write about certain groups. So in totality, how would you see and how do you rate the way this self-censorship is playing itself out in a media landscape that includes both the negativity of both the carrot and the stick to journalists?
Well, I mean, I think there is a very strong link between the overt censorship and the self-censorship. So certainly when you have the decimation of the community that helped bring about political change in the region, especially if we look at Egypt, the recent rearrest of Abdel Fattah, who already served his 5-year prison sentence, and even after getting out was required to report back every night to jail, amounting to another, prison census, and then getting put back on, in prison. We have the recent arrest of Ezra Fatah, another leading figure from the revolutions who was arrested on charges of spreading false news and abusing social media networks and is now on a hunger strike. We talk about numbers, but there are people behind each of these numbers, and these people have friends, and they're known in the community. They're known, or maybe were known. They won't be known to this coming generation, perhaps. But it sends a very strong signal when you can jail those people and pay no price. So that definitely has a self-censorship impact. But then you've also got this, of course, trying to avoid any sort of repercussions and then censoring yourself. And then the role, I want to bring in the corporate media role, because it is a very different environment and media ecosystem than it was around the uprisings, when you had this creativity and imagination and people could imagine a different future and wanted to bring that about. Now you've got many fewer platforms. You've got some globally hegemonic platforms where you really need to be visible. And those platforms have to have a presence on the ground, and they have vested interests in accessing markets. And so now we see that these battles and these censorship battles are also being played out online with the additional vector of primarily American-owned, Silicon Valley-based media outlets or platforms for dissemination. So you've got the Palestinian, both the diaspora and in Palestine, really battling to have their information stay online. We saw just in the past couple of weeks how so many Egyptian journalists and activists were silenced on Twitter when their accounts were closed and their content was removed. And Twitter's response was, oh, it was spam, or the behavior looked spammy, or it looked inauthentic, because they said, oh, they were using hashtags too much, or whatever it is. So then, you know, one activist described it as they censored themselves by using different words, and then even those words, because they were in Arabic, were censored. There's not a good understanding by these platforms, which are, again, based in California, about how to translate this information. You've got examples of journalists who rely on, for example, Facebook to get out information because there is not accessibility to independent media. Most broadcasters are state-owned in the region. Most print newspapers want to have an online presence only, or as well, and so you know they're really relying on these platforms to get out information. But you know, one of my roles at the Committee to Protect Journalists is to talk to the companies when journalists get their accounts taken offline and try to find out why. And you know, it just seems like so many times it ends up being, oh, there was an error. And this can lead to self-censorship as well, because these platforms are such important places where the narrative is playing out. And then, of course, you have the broader geopolitical battles between, you know, the Gulf and Qatar, and the influence that that has on journalists who, you know, now Al Jazeera is not accessible in the Gulf. You have to think about those dynamics. There, you know, again, with the Egypt example, there are concerns that there was some sort of political involvement in some of the hashtags and accounts that were taken down. You know, I was reading about the Assisi-related hashtag that suddenly disappeared. So no one knows why this is, because the companies are not open and transparent about their decision-making processes or provide any sort of independent auditing of the accounts that are taken down or the content that's taken down. So we just don't know about political manipulation. So, you know, this whole factor of things, and then you add into it new registration requirements, for example, in Jordan and elsewhere, where you have to license blogs or online news outlets that have over a certain number of readers. And so that also has a self-censoring impact, because a lot of people don't want to have to register with the government for a variety of reasons. And then if you choose not to do that, then you can be censored in that country and elsewhere. So there are a whole constellation of factors that are conspiring to engage in both outright and self-censorship.
Thank you, Courtney. I mean, the role the digital big giants are playing, not only in, as you said, bringing down some sites, but also they're sucking up all the advertising that used to go to local media, and local media is really suffering a lot. I'll add a name to your list of people that you should defend. Fadi Salameen, he's a Palestinian here in Washington, D.C., whose Facebook account has been brought down. He's been often critical of Mahmoud Abbas. I want to move back to the Gulf and to Saudi Arabia. Hala, activities of Mohammed bin Salman has been well documented in his role in Jabal Khashoggi, but I know many inside Saudi Arabia are not as negative towards him because of some of the reform he's done, not only about women driving, but also opening up cinemas, opening up cultural activities. I know in Jordan, the annual Jarash festival used to get a lot of Saudis to come. This year, a few came, and we asked why, and they said because they're having their own festivals now in Saudi Arabia. So there is an openingness to a certain degree. Does that change public opinion? Does that kind of whitewash or cover what else is Jamal has been doing, what else MBS has been doing in Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, I think this is very legitimate concern. What's happening in Saudi Arabia is very much largely driven by two factors. First, the need to find economic reforms in a land that has been for decades dependent on oil revenues, which has been really getting a hit since 2014, and especially now with the new strikes on the regional geopolitical outcomes from the engagement of Saudi and Yemen. So yes, the economy has been a triggering factor for reform. We cannot afford in Saudi Arabia to remain a country that is dependent on oil, more so because of the adventures and the aspirations of Mohammed bin Salman in the region, which buying allegiance, buying legitimacy in that case. is costly. The other thing is, the PR, basically presenting someone who's new to the power would require certain selling out of image, and the allies that he's seeking the protection from and seeking their support for his Vision 2030 to succeed are necessarily on a different cultural level. They're more open, they're more diverse and global in values than the traditional setting within Saudi Arabia. And to incite those people to invest first to support the new coming leader in Saudi Arabia and to invest in Saudi Arabia to increase the foreign investment inside Saudi Arabia would require certain reforms in the social setting as well. But the problem comes in the duality, whether citizens in Saudi Arabia are buying into these reforms. They are all attractive reforms that people within Saudi Arabia have been really seeking for decades, allowing women to commute, allowing them to travel, to be able to register their children in family records, also allowing more of a social opening without the fear from the repercussions of the religious police. But now comes the Decency Laws, this kind of uninformed policies which doesn't really rely on honest reporting from the ground, has been backfiring at certain incidents. So you get to see on social media outcries from within Saudi Arabia on people reporting being fined for wearing shorts while exercising as Saudi people, or women dancing in one of those festivals while completely covered. And at the same time, comparing those incidents, the hypocrisy of having those, Saudis being targeted for engaging in those reforms while foreign tourists or reporters are allowed to take pictures in bathing suits and to dance and to have access to hotel rooms as partners without any documentation of marriage. So you get to see those things played out, and in turn, in Saudi Arabia, this kind of social reforms is very much like short-lived, and you need to have more of well-grounded reforms, especially if you are, trying to attract youth and to buy into youth. So the most important factors, and this has been like an ongoing, claim for so many years inside Saudi Arabia, is how to fend off unemployment. The rate has been very much like increasing, and you get to see people from within and outside Saudi Arabia are demanding more jobs, and this is the real deliverable of any reforms rather than this kind of fanfare of social reforms.
Thank you so much, Hala. I want to go back to Sut from University of Massachusetts in Amherst. When the Egyptian Sisi government had an Australian guy from Al Jazeera arrested on claims that he was Muslim Brotherhood, even though he ate pork and drank wine and everything else. But there was a concerted effort to get him released, while non-Western country journalists were not. And the Gaza situation, where journalists have been shot at, killed, and many have been arrested, barely ever make the media scene. So can you talk us about how the American media is covering these issues, and especially in the MENA region, and how has there been a role for the pro-Israel lobby in silencing some of the attacks against the allies of the U.S., as they call them, Israel, whether it's Saudi Arabia or others?
Yeah, I mean, the broad activities of the Israel lobby control, again, the context within which almost all of this takes place. I mean, it's very noticeable, I think, in the Great March in Gaza, where Israel has deliberately targeted journalists. I mean, deliberately targeted them. That has made almost no mention in mainstream American media. The only place I've seen it that's really been focused on it has been in independent media like Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! That focuses on it, because Amy Goodman actually knows something about independent journalism and knows what the role of independent journalism should be and what the role of journalism should be. In terms of the idea of self-censorship is, I mean, it's kind of embedded in how journalists think of covering Israel. What they have to think about is, am I going to tell the truth? Am I going to cover what's really going on and risk a call from my editor, risk getting fired? Or am I going to do the best that I can within the frame, within the opportunities that I have? and to, you know, and to do as much as I can. That's a very different way of thinking about what journalism means. In most of the rest of the world, if you're just doing the work of journalism, or if you're a dissident journalist, you have a chance of being killed. You have a chance of being tortured. You have a chance of being imprisoned to do your job, and therefore it takes, you know, enormous commitment to the moral value of journalism to do that. In the U.S., all that can happen is you'd lose your job. And therefore, once you go into mainstream American media looking at these issues, you've already made that compromise. And I think one of the reasons that, I'm speculating here, I think one of the reasons that there isn't a lot of focus on these journalists being killed in Gaza and around the rest of the world is that American journalists are embarrassed about what real journalism looks like in the rest of the world. And if they were to focus on that, they would have to pay attention to what they were doing and what they were not doing. And it's much easier, and they've already made the decision. They've already made the decision that they want to hang on to their jobs rather than do anything else.
Thank you. We covered in the first round the problem. We talked about silencing dissent. And now, despite all of that, we've had courageous journalists, courageous media outlets that have continued to fight. And I think, you know, we really salute these people. And the question now, I think, to many is how the narrative is being controlled. I mean, there are people who basically are unable to stop the news from coming out. But the problem is, what are we doing about the spin? Because the spin is sometimes making the news sound and move and look in a different way. And so I remember once in Jordan when they, in 2013, they blocked about 1,300 websites, including the one I was running, Amman.net. We kept on, there was a kind of cat and mouse game. We would change the domain name, and then a week later they would block us, and then we'd change it again, and so on. So I think there are people who try to fight the system. Some of them are forced to leave and live outside. Some of them continue to live in their countries. Some of them use pseudonyms. But I want to start again with Sarah about Human Rights Watch, and what do you and Human Rights Watch suggest as the best short, medium-term, and even long-term strategy that can be used to deal with this reality? How do we not only give people a voice, but also make sure that their voice is not being spun in a different way?
Well, I mean, the answer I have, of course, isn't limited to the confines of my work or outlook from Human Rights Watch. Although for the short term, I think continuing to act as a support of exposing and documenting the reality of what's happening on the ground in the Middle East and North Africa in particular remains vitally important, because the value of truth and the value of affirming the truth for people who are experiencing brutality and repression may well be the only justice that they see in their lifetimes. I continue to believe in the short term is extremely important. And I would not indict American journalists that broadly. A number of American journalists, some of them people I know, some of whom I've worked with, have died covering the conflicts in the Middle East, have given their lives knowing they were putting themselves in a war zone to document what was happening on the ground in Syria and Libya, to name just two places. I think the journalists at the New York Times have done a phenomenal job keeping an eye on what's happening in Egypt, to give just one example. In the medium term, I think that the broader community of people involved in work in the Middle East should think about supporting and investing in the future of the Middle East by supporting and investing in the exiles from the Middle East who are scattered in many parts of the world, including the United States, but other parts of the world, cut off from what they know, their families, their livelihoods. And yet, the reason they're in that situation for many, if not most, is that they were committed to democracy and freedom and rights in their countries. They, I think, are the best hope for developing in a future for the Middle East. because one day, hopefully, they will return to contribute to their countries. And I think they can contribute to their countries now by serving as honest journalists, by serving as honest critics, and serving freely in whatever capacity they have. Finally, I think, and this is probably the most difficult piece of it in terms of the long term, is how to invest in the education of Arab youth. Because as I started my remarks by noting, they are being deliberately de-educated, miseducated, in terms of knowledge and information, not just about what's happening in their country at a particular time and moment by the repression, censorship of the news, but in terms of having a historical understanding of what's happened in their countries, and also an understanding of the values and concepts and practices of what democracy means and what human rights means. And so I think it's hugely important for, again, all of us engaged in this area of the world to figure out how to deliver that knowledge and education to the youth of the Arab world. What does democracy mean? What does free speech mean? What does terrorism mean or not mean? And finding a way to get that information to them is probably going to be next challenge for many of us to work on.
So you're hopeful. You sound a bit optimistic, no?
Of course.
Good. Courtney, you think journalists have become more adept at circumventing government restrictions? Does CPJ provide digital safety courses to journalists? Have they been successful? Have you been helping them to kind of avoid all these restrictions?
There are a couple of different ways to answer that. So first off, the surveillance apparatus and technologies are so sophisticated and so advanced. It is very challenging to keep up. There was the report about the Raven, which is a new technology, a surveillance technology where you don't even have to pull it in, right? So with the spear phishing attacks, most of Pegasus was delivered by clicking on a link, phishing, or some sort of other kind of pull technology. You had to do something. But now there are technologies, surveillance technologies, and it looks like also the WhatsApp, vulnerability, as well as Raven, the pull technologies are push technologies where you don't even have to do anything. All you need is the phone number of somebody or the email of somebody. So how do you protect against that? It's very, very challenging. We definitely do provide cybersecurity and digital security guidance and advice to journalists, including doing basic things like use two-factor authentication. A lot of the hacking and surveillance of journalists is not using the most sophisticated technology and taking a few simple steps like turning on two-factor authentication, using a password manager so you can use long passwords, wiping your devices if you're going into a sensitive area or crossing a border or anywhere where you think your device might get stolen. That sort of thing we definitely do, but it's really challenging to think about what people can actually do to keep themselves safe against these very sophisticated technologies. Furthermore, the information ecosystem is one of both information control and drowning out of those independent voices that are trying to circumvent censorship or circumvent control. So, I mentioned computational propaganda, state-sponsored trolling. They are hiring in many countries in the Arab region and also around the world, bots, botnets, armies, cyber armies. Sometimes this is part of the security apparatus. Other times they are amateurs or volunteers, and these are being deployed around the region to target those dissenters or oppositional voices so that they try to delegitimize them, or they try to drown out, their voice online. They're also using manipulation of the algorithms in order to silence, efforts to get something to trend, or again to bypass that information control. And sometimes they're doing this with the assistance of Western and American firms. For example, McKinsey created a list of social media influencers in Saudi Arabia who were against, one of the state policies, and then Saudi Arabia used that to target those users, and some of their accounts were taken down, some of them were imprisoned. So there is a range of tactics that are being used, and it's very difficult for an individual voice to bypass these state-executed or directed or incited computational propaganda campaigns. So it's not so much, so they're both trying to control the information from getting out to begin with. Once it's out there, targeting and intimidating those people and journalists who are expressing themselves or trying to independently report online, or drowning out the conversation entirely. And then, of course, we don't know what sort of pressure is being put on, the companies behind the scenes. Meanwhile, you've got this complete abdication of leadership by, some of the countries like the United States that have typically been there as an ally for some of these journalists. And so you had this revelation by A.G. Sulzberger, the editor-in-chief of the New York Times, or the publisher rather, who revealed that the U.S. did not warn Declan Walsh, their correspondent in Egypt, that he was about to get arrested, and a diplomat had to warn him on the side. And I would just respond, to the criticism of American journalists. I think that's way too broad, having worked as a journalist in the Middle East and in the United States for the New York Times, and in Lebanon, Egypt, and Dubai. I think that you have to look at the individual level of the journalists and what they're trying to do and what sort of stories they are getting out. And everyone has a different fulcrum on which they balanced. The Daily Star had its own way of looking at the conflicts there. The Al Arabiya, we had, pretty clear guidance on how to cover, the Iranian Revolution in 2009, but otherwise we're relatively, open to cover what we wanted until they fired you for covering the wrong story. And then at the New York Times, again, they have a different fulcrum from where they balance, and part of that is based on who you perceive as your audience. So I, have lost friends. I have friends in jail who are both American and who are local journalists, and I think it's important to pay tribute to the people who are on the front lines and who are reporting in very challenging situations. And it's not just war zones, it's reporting on women's rights. It's reporting on the environment. There are journalists in jail, in Saudi Arabia because they were reporting on the women rights campaign. So, across the board, journalists are putting their lives and their livelihoods on the line to try to report.
Courtney, some immigration officials and police, including the U.S., ask journalists and others to give them the password of the Facebook. Is that legal? Are you supposed to oblige to that? What can you do if you say no? They'll kick you out?
So this is a huge issue, and actually started under the Obama administration, where we saw that the Department of Homeland Security was targeting journalists who had been reporting in Arab or Muslim-majority countries, especially with terrorism issues, where they were pulling them out for secondary screening and asking to see their devices. Borders are kind of like rights-free zones. It's very unclear what rights you have at the border, and we have definitely seen journalists who have not wanted to give access to their devices, turned away, and not allowed to enter the U.S. if they were not a U.S. citizen. Sometimes they're able to push back. For example, I think it was Maria Habib, who worked for the Wall Street Journal, who said, you've got to talk to my outlet's lawyers first because these devices belong to them. But if you're a freelance journalist or you're, an independent blogger, it's very tough to not give up that information. And now DHS wants social media profile information, and they have also retaliated against journalists and individuals who have information on their social media that the government somehow doesn't like. So at this point, it does seem to be legal, but there are a lot of things that our Department of Homeland Security are doing that are severely problematic, and including keeping databases of journalists reporting on the migrant crisis, which we think they probably were doing the same sort of thing of journalists reporting on terrorism. Otherwise, how would you know to target them for secondary screening? But the problem is, again, so much of these issues have to do with transparency and accountability.
Yeah, when American president calls the press the enemy of the people, it resonates around the world, unfortunately.
Yes.
We're about done. We have two more commentaries. If you have questions, please start writing them now and get them to me so we can immediately move into the second stage. Hannah, are the Saudis, journalists and non-journalists, able to bypass or overcome these restrictions? Does eroding space for critical research and writing affect what they're doing? Are women's rights activists able to write and engage in media, even though their books are being prohibited by the state and by the religious authority? Do you see some kind of positive signs there of people bypassing these restrictions?
Well, I think the problem is not in bypassing it. I think the problem is in the, this kind of out of law, or basically the law becomes the regime. So it's not like again, to the problem of having regulations with catch-all terms. Also, the problem is you're not bound by any kinds of written law, as a journalist or as a campaigner or as an advocate for certain human rights or a blogger. Your job is actually information, disseminating information, forming networks of people, building this kind of relationship over years with, if you're an activist or a scholar, to pass the information to correspondent journalists or people who are on the ground for years. I mean, that could be very much like criminalized, and it's very selective in nature. Not everyone is targeted, but the most prominent voices. So I don't think the problem is in regulation per se, because regulation has never been specific and has never been respected in terms of political will. But in the targeting of people without any kinds, outside, the rule of law. And itself, that is very much limiting. We've seen that in, the 14 demands that, the coalition countries have demanded from Qatar. On top of it is Al Jazeera. We used to write for Al Jazeera so as scholars and activists. We used to write about issues without any kinds of political problems. But once the decision to blockade Qatar, or to basically stop any kinds of engagement with Qatar, has come to effect, all of the people who used to contribute has been retrospectively, basically, been targeted, despite the fact that none of us have been informed of any kinds of problems in writing for any kinds of media outlets. One of the charges against the women activists is their engagement with the media at large. So it's not about having to protect yourself, even if you have very legitimate communication with, with fellow activists, with media people, in issues that are not considered any kinds of national security. That could be basis for your targeting. So I don't think it's about, having a secure engagement with your constituencies or people. It's more of this kind of, out of law practices of the government in the region.
Thanks so much, Hala. I want to end with a kind of a bit different. I want to look more into the U.S. scene, and we've talked a lot about the Arab authoritarian governments using various legal methods to restrict speech, attempting to muzzle contrary points of view. But we know that that's not limited to the Arab world. In the U.S., despite its First Amendment, issues like Palestine, like BDS, have been singled out as an attempt to kind of muzzle and stop people from expressing themselves. So can you give us a short view of how this First Amendment is being abused in the United States? And is there a crack? You think there is some cracks happening in the pro-Israel lobby, in the Israeli control of the narrative, as far as Palestine is concerned?
I'm trying to think how to do this in a short frame. Obviously, the efforts by the Israel lobby to control the discourse has gone through many different frames over the years. At the moment, the most important is, they have weaponized anti-Semitism. And so any criticism of Israel is seen automatically as being anti-Semitic, and it's very difficult now to separate out those two things. And so that's the major kind of silencing mechanism that's being used, because no one wants to be accused of being a racist. No one wants to be accused of being anti-Semitic, and therefore it's easier not to say anything. We've seen how this is happening here. We've seen how it's happening in the UK as well, in which there's a major effort to stop any kind of criticism of Israeli policy within the Labour Party based precisely around this notion of anti-Semitism. So that's the major way that frame is being adopted right now. And certainly there are cracks in this discourse now. And we know we just can look at the Democratic primary and look to see how the candidates are talking or not talking about it. I mean, not one Democratic contender went to AIPAC this year. That is a major change from the past. And I think we have to give credit to people like Bernie Sanders, who has used his power to introduce introduce something new into the discourse, although even he is responding, of course, to activism on the ground. He's responding to what's happening within the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And I think because of the primaries going on right now, that there is a small crack, I think, in the Democratic Party, and that has now become highlighted more and more. And the more it becomes highlighted, the easier it is for people to speak about it. So I think we're in the situation now where the control is very intense still, and around accusations of anti-Semitism for talking about these things. At the same time, more and more people are speaking out. And I'll just end with one brief concrete example. Last May at the University of Massachusetts, I organized a panel or an event based on, it was called Not Backing Down. And it was about the backlash against pro-Palestinian voices and how more and more people are not backing down. And we had people come to this event and people said, you know, I've been to hundreds of events and normally they involve 2 or 3 or perhaps 10 people who come to these events. The event we had 1,600 people in it.
Wow.
And that would not have happened
Wow.
even 3 years ago or 4 years ago. And something I think something is changing. There is a crack, and the question is whether you can push that crack open and make something significant out of it.
Even the presidential candidates are now speaking out a bit more, no? I've noticed more than ever before. At least there's some opening.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are talking about conditioning aid to Israel. That's never happened before. Right? I mean, in terms of the cracks in the discourse. So even though, I mean, I tend to focus on these broad structural issues, and it can be very depressing looking at them, but there is, you know, when you do the broad analysis, you do miss what is also going on in the cracks as well. And I think we're in a place where there is a major crack that is developing.
Thank you so much. I'll start doing the questions, and I'll start with Courtney. Lamia El-Far says, Courtney mentioned this significant crackdown on free speech in Egypt, in particular, with spike in jailing journalists, etc. But Egypt also seems to champion higher participation in entrepreneurship activities, with supporting SMEs and so on and so forth. Under these conditions, she goes on and on. But basically, how do you explain the negative media coverage of Arab countries who are also allies like Saudi Arabia and Egypt? She concludes. So on the one hand, she's saying things are improving economically and they're helping the entrepreneurship, and yet she's saying there's a lot of negativity of media coverage of Arab countries.
I mean, I think that it is very challenging for businesses to think about investing in a country that jails journalists, that jails foreigners, and shuts down the internet, restricts information. We saw this in some of the responses by countries, for example, that were based in Egypt around the uprising, and seeing that they were willing to do a whole-scale shutdown for numerous days, and what that does to business. I mean, I think, you know, thank goodness for local entrepreneurs. You know, it's amazing the resiliency of the people on the ground under very challenging circumstances. But I think that, you know, it is those, you know, to use different form of cracks, it is those cracks. It's not a monolithic authoritarian system. There are always cracks. There is so much creativity, especially, you know, I spent a lot of time in Egypt and got to know a lot of people there, and the imagination, the interest in imagining a different future. I think we see that in entrepreneurship, and I think I just want to read like 2 sentences or 1 sentence from a letter that Ezra Fatah wrote from prison a couple years ago, because I think that it's it's very important, because he was talking about how they succeeded in bringing about this change, but then they were defeated by the powers that be, because those people who bring about change are not necessarily the same ones who can institutionalize it. And he said, but then we were defeated, and meaning was defeated with us. And since our defeat, whenever a complex issue has been raised, it has been immediately trivialized, so that understanding it has become difficult and action virtually impossible. And I think that it's those, we do have to see beyond just the people on the front lines to see what is happening in the cracks. I think that there is never any turning back, although I'm very pessimist about the, say, immediate future. I think I have to try to share some of Sarah's optimism, that I don't think that after the experience that people on the ground in Egypt had, that there is ever any going back. And you can see that in the really creative, entrepreneurial, media and all sorts of other things happening there.
Thanks. Sarah, a few questions to you. Simple one is, how reliable is the annual U.S. State Department report on human rights? A bit more complicated one is about Lebanon. And Dr. Ghassan, thank you for raising the case of Lebanon. Please note that if you dare mention the head of Amal militia, Speaker of the Parliament, Nabih Berri, or head of the Progressive Socialist Party, Walid Jumblat, you'll be killed. So that was to you. Any comments on both?
In terms of the State Department reports, historically, I should say, I think they have been very, very good. And that is because of a strong tradition of independence of the State Department's Bureau of Rights and Labor, where the human rights chapter presenters reside and sit. And, they're obviously a short survey report by nature, and they tend to be very limited in terms of presentation of facts without analysis, certainly without any questioning of the U.S. support for a variety of the governments that, the abuses of which are documented in the U.S. State Department reports. I know that the chapter on Israel-Palestine has always been the most difficult and the most contentious for them, and that is because of the very close ties between the U.S. government and the Israel lobby, which monitors and surveils what the State Department says on Israel very closely. So a lot of caution there. To be honest, I did not review this last year's report.
We'll have Seth answer that. Don't worry.
Yeah.
But Lebanon.
Lebanon, I don't think it's true yet, because people have been criticizing them, and if you look across the streets of Lebanon, you'll see plenty of criticism of those 2 gentlemen, and even more other gentlemen behind them in the streets, and so far there haven't been any fatalities. I hope that remains the same, and I wish we could say as much for the protesters in Iraq, where it's, well, of course, of Syria, but as in now, as in today, as in this week, in the past 2 weeks, over 250 youth have been murdered on the streets of Iraq.
So, in addition to the human rights report, Isaac from the American Prospect writes, earlier this year, the New York Times inadvertently revealed that its in-house style book forbade journalists from referring to Gaza as occupied in 1994. I'm not sure it's true, but when Israel was occupying Gaza, can you address this in light of your defense of U.S. media, or whoever defended U.S. media? I don't think anybody. Nobody defended U.S. media, but that basically the New York Times tries to water down the term occupation, as the human rights report actually took it out totally. But one more point, Rula, PR consultant, as mentioned, U.S. media are guilty of self-censorship. Example, U.S. journalists not being able to humanize the Gaza residents during the 2008 conflict. Is there a true free press anywhere in the world? So basically, U.S. coverage of the media, the word occupation, whether it's in the human rights report or whether in the main corporate media.
Well, of course, there is a major conflict over whether you can even say the word occupation anymore. I mean, the rest of the world talks about occupation, and the Israel lobby has tried to say, well, you can't use the word occupation anymore. It's something else. And so this kind of, lexical struggle has always been going on. I mean, there were also reports. CNN a few years ago sent out a memo saying that you could not refer to settlements as settlements, but they were now communities.
The neighborhoods, they call them.
Neighborhoods. A neighborhood is just a nice, everyone lives in a neighborhood. And so this kind of, with this close lexical control, you don't see it very often, but sometimes, what's the best way to get information out to an organization? You send out a memo. And sometimes these memos get out and you can see exactly how the control of language is used.
To Hala from Dina Khmeri, the Tadamun. There are many goals of MBS's Vision 2030, including diversification, physical reform, employment. How do we hold MBS and the government accountable via media for these changes when there is a gap between projected goals and enacted reform? And to you, Hala. And what is the role of non-government institutions, i.e. Saudi Aramco, with influence during these times of reform?
Well, I think, so yes, there are so many. We have to remember as well that these, objectives of the Vision 2030 have been very much used also in the campaign to promote the economy or the economic opportunities within Saudi Arabia, both to domestic and to the foreign investors. But again, I think the problem in accountability, how do you hold the government accountable under an absolute monarchy? I mean, if you don't have an independent media, if you don't have a parliament, if you don't have freedom of expression, which is very evident, it's very difficult to have the transparency that you need, to access to information. Today, figures, when it comes to unemployment figures, is very much difficult to attain. So how can you basically create this kind of public awareness, first to access those kinds of actual figures and information, and second to have them disseminated or campaign at least in the court of the public opinion, if not in reality. As for the NGOs in Saudi Arabia, they're very much working as charities, so they're very much encouraged as well as part of reducing the public spending. So charities are very much encouraged inside Saudi Arabia, which has been historically a domain of the government. So the government has been sponsoring all kinds of charity work or organizations and have been presenting them in international platforms as NGOs, which is not true because they're not independent, and second, they're not engaged in public affairs per se or the public debate on contentious issues. They're very much related to service provision. So, for instance, giving financial or some kind of limited resources to the impoverished or needy, groups. There are some groups who have been really making some kind of a progress, like Mawadda organizations. It has been successful in building relationship, and this is a very, very interesting area as well. Because of lack of regulations, there is no definitive regulation that decides or dictates what is allowable and what is prohibited inside Saudi Arabia. It has provided a venue for people who are working in more or less safer places or places which are needed by the government to somehow forge some kind of existence or a presence on the ground. Like Mawadda, as I said, Mawadda organization works with the divorced women in order to reform divorce law, procedural law mainly, not the substantive law. So basically expedites the proceedings of a certain case in court, providing women with some kind of legal support, engaging with officials in the Ministry of Justice or with the lawyers community, in order to educate them more about the main structural problems within the Saudi legal system. So it has been making a progress, very limited progress, because it's not substantial again, or it's not in the removal.
Saudi Aramco and also the Yemen war.
Yeah, Saudi Aramco has been very much a venue to promote. it's now functioning very much like a way to promote the skills of the Saudi youth, which is very much needed. But then the problem comes in this kind of limited vision to youth as economic assets, and this has been actually mentioned in the Vision 2030, the reference to youth as economic assets. So yes, the government wants people who are skilled Saudi, people who are skilled, who are well-trained, but well-trained only to mobilize the economy, or basically make sure that the economic needs are met, not necessarily as engaged or informed citizens, which is the problem. So most of the initiatives of Aramco are very much geared towards promoting the image of Saudi Arabia abroad, bringing people from outside of Saudi Arabia as ambassadors to sites within Saudi Arabia to have some kind of experience with elites, and very much like tailored and crafted visits within Saudi Arabia to go back to their own countries and build this kind of networks, more or less like the US maybe outreach programs. But it is very much limited on the scope and on the actual impact on youth. So I wouldn't really talk much about that. The
Yemen war, has it
very much
affected
like,
internally?
Of course.
Discussion, debate, media.
No, this is one of the most problematic issues, because people who have Jamal Khashoggi, who has been at the beginning very much like welcoming the initiative of intervention of Saudi Arabia under the pretext of coalition and under the control of an international UN target, basically, or supervision, to intervene in Yemen and to make sure that the legitimate government has been restored, to curb back against the Iranian influence, or to create this kind of civil wars. Once the war has progressed into the worst human-made crisis, Jamal Khashoggi has changed his opinion, has been very much providing the classic case of what happens to people who are taking this kind of a stand. Of course, you can't really sense how people feel under authoritarian government, such an oppressive government as Saudi Arabia. You can never sense, if what you're seeing online or in the print media actually reflects what people think. And even the self-censorship, which has been mentioned, people are now learning to basically say what's safe enough when they are asked by foreign visitors or foreign journalists.
Thank you. Sarah, 2 questions for you. One from Safi Hamid, the Clear Center for Egypt-American Relations. Since the only element of the population left who can criticize publicly are the immigrants and expatriates, what can Human Rights Watch and similar organizations do to support them in front of the threats of authoritarian governments? And from Faris, also Egyptian-American kid, how do we push a regime to create a constitution? I believe that conflicts are seizing power before using a solid agreement to enforce, I can't figure this out, but to really reform the constitution, basically. He's asking, and the other one is saying that Human Rights Watch should support the immigrants in expressing themselves.
Well, I mean, I guess I would say we indirectly try to support the exiles, the political exiles from the region. A number of them work for Human Rights Watch, as well as various other human rights organizations, so we directly benefit from their knowledge, experience, and relative freedom. But I think the kind of support that I was describing earlier in terms of a medium-term plan would take the organizational capacities and resources of different from what Human Rights Watch has. We're actually, particularly the MENA division, very small. I tell people, and they're often surprised, we have one person who works, one researcher who covers Egypt at Human Rights Watch. So we wouldn't have the capacity to provide the sort of support and investment that I was describing. I didn't really understand the second question.
Okay. Courtney, sensational journalism. What can we do, succeeding freedom of expression, what can we do about sensationalism, and how do you create an informative, educational dynamic of journalism? And somebody else asked a question about, do you believe education without employment opportunities or proper infrastructure in the MENA region is counterintuitive to the limiting of extremism? In other words, that it basically encourages extremism.
Just a few small issues to deal with there. Okay. I mean, I think that ultimately it's up to journalists to decide, and media outlets to decide what their editorial approach is going to be. And one of the key factors that you need to ensure that there is also good journalism is independence and pluralism and freedom. You need to be able to work safely, and we need a pluralistic media environment where you have different types of media that are based on different types of funding mechanisms. So whether that's private advertising, whether that's subscription, whether that's nonprofit, whether that's public interest, state-funded media, because you need all different types of media. Some journalism is going to aim at sensationalism, but I get worried about talking about how to put on editorial controls when the fact is we really need more journalism, I think. I think one of the things that really struck me about living in Egypt and studying the media there was, how little local journalism there was. I think there are some very interesting hyper-local initiatives, and I think there's a great promise for local news and improvements and investment in local news to combat some of the sensationalism. But also, this issue of language, I think, is really an important one, and I do want to take a second just to address that, because I think we can fixate on things about like what one word is used. I think it's interesting. I've noticed that Palestine is used more often as a term, and I think 10 years ago we didn't see that in American media very much. And the other thing is, every news organization has a style guide. At Al Arabiya, part of what we did with the wire copy was Arabize it. So we would change terms to be more, interesting and relevant to our audience. So I think we want to keep things in perspective. And also that journalists, are always trying to find the most neutral and least biased way to describe something. In fact, my old boss, Rami Houri, is somewhere in the audience from the Daily Star, but I remember my first ever op-ed, and first thing I published in the Arab media was called What's in a Name. It was trying to think about the least biased way to call the Israel separation barrier, and I don't know what we're calling it now. That was like many years ago. But I think that we need to be careful with like broad brushstrokes, and in terms of addressing sensationalism, you can choose where you get your news, where you click, where you subscribe, and if we want to have good, straightforward news reporting on interests that are relevant on issues that are relevant to us, then we're going to have to pay for it.
Thank you. There's a big new genre coming up in journalism called solution journalism, and a lot of journalists are now rethinking the whole concept of journalism. We have 5 minutes, and if everybody wants to speak for 1 minute, I'll allow it. Otherwise, I'll conclude. Sarah, anything?
I think I probably
You pass?
overspoke my quota.
That? Courtney? Okay. So we had a nice discussion, I think. Did you want to say anything else?
No, I'm good.
No. We had a nice discussion on the issues of controlling the narrative, silencing dissent, media politics, and freedom of expression. I urge all of you to stay around for the 3:30 session on cyber geopolitics and the weaponization of social media. Jessica Dare, Deputy Director, Ranking Digital Rights. Ryan Grimm, DC Bureau Chief of The Intercept. Karen Gullo, Analyst and Senior Media Relations Specialist in Electronic Frontier Foundation. Mark Owen Jones, Assistant Professor in Middle East Studies in Digital Humanities at Hamad bin Khalifa University, and moderated by the only Tamara Kharoub. Thank you so much for attending.